Today, in our continuing discussion of modern art, we are going to discuss Post-Impressionism. This is my favorite art history movement, and we'll also be using Post-Impressionism to talk about how the method of display, location, and experience of an artwork influence how it is perceived and valued. So let's talk about how art is valued to start. What things affect the perceived value of artwork? And again, we're using the word perceived here because the value of artwork, how much money it is worth, really depends on what people think. I mean, if you take a look at a painting, even a famous painting, and you break it down to the objects, it's a canvas and some paint. And that alone should be worth $10, $20 or so. But instead, you see art being sold for thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, or even more, depending, of course, on a couple of things. Depending on the fame of the artist itself, how old the art is, the owner or the museum the art is currently in, and the story behind the art. So even if you make art here in 8th grade that is more amazing and more impressive than some of the art we're going to talk about today, you probably won't make as much money as them until you're famous, until the art is old, until someone else has owned it first, and then someone else can buy it from them, and of course, if there's a story behind it. So, modern art. We talked about Impressionism most recently here in this box, and Post-Impressionism comes right after. Post is a prefix that means after. So we know that Post-Impressionist comes after Impressionism. It is the first movement in this wave of movements that come along. So let's briefly review what Impressionism was like. The Impressionists, they painted outdoors. It was very spur of the moment. Everything was bright, it was colorful, it was shining. There wasn't any muddy canvases. They weren't going for realism. They were looking for pretty and what life felt like. They painted with quick, incomplete brushstrokes, and they inspired the art world to start taking risks and follow their own interests. So they said, and the rest of the world said, if the Impressionism could do that, I can do whatever I want. The Post-Impressionists came along, and they saw Impressionism, and they were influenced by it. Of course they were. Everyone was. Hence your essay that you wrote recently. They loved the bright colors and the free brushstrokes. They didn't like how spur of the moment it was. They thought maybe it could be a little bit more planned. They wanted paintings to be more substantial, more planned. They wanted a best of both worlds, with the look of Impressionism, but the thought out in advance of their own style, which they then created. So here are our big name Post-Impressionists. There were a lot more of them, but these gentlemen are the most famous of the Post-Impressionists, and we're going to talk about some of them today. Georges Seurat, who we will chat about, was a pointillist. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, he's my favorite Post-Impressionist. I wish I could talk about him more, but we don't have time. Paul Cezanne was a Post-Impressionist who focused mainly on still lifes. You may have seen things like his fruit baskets. Paul Gauguin was a Post-Impressionist who lived both in France and Tahiti, so he painted a lot of Tahitian women, and he was a jerk, and I hate him. And Vincent Van Gogh, who we're going to be focusing on today. He is by far the most famous and one of my favorites to talk about. And he painted this one. I'm sure you've seen this painting. Think about the name. You know it. Starry Night. Technically, it's called Starry Night. And one of the things I love about Van Gogh and his art is you can see when you see it in person how thick he painted. Just globs of paint that he mixed right on the canvas. And you can see the canvas underneath it, direct color, direct onto the canvas to make these beautiful works of art. I have been lucky enough to get to see Starry Night 2 times in person. The first time I was able to get this close, actually, and see from an angle the globs of paint. Since then, it's a little bit more protected. Now, and here's another one of his most famous ones, sunflowers. We recreate this with my third graders, and another chance for you to see close up how you can see the thick paint. That's inspired by the Impressionists right before them, and painting directly onto the canvas. Now, who was Van Gogh? This is a self-portrait that he's painted of himself, and he is famous mainly because we know so much about him. He meticulously kept track of his own life through letters to his brother Theo. Van Gogh was born in the Netherlands, but he moved to live and work in France because that's where the art scene was. That's where all the artists were. So he left the Netherlands, moved to France, and that's why he would write his brother letters frequently, since they weren't together. And his letters detailed about the paintings he was going to do in great, beautiful, poetic detail. I have a book in my classroom that has snippets of his letters describing the colors of his paintings. And he would write about what was going on in his life, the people he would meet, the things he would do, the places he would go. Now, unfortunately, even though he worked with other artists in France, he did not have a great life. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So this is his house in Arles. This is where he spent a lot of his life as a professional. He lived in Paris for a while. That's where he met his friends. His biggest friend was Gauguin, and they had a really difficult friendship. Van Gogh struggled a lot with his mental health. He had very serious clinical depression, and if you know anyone with depression, you know that they might have difficult moods. They might be difficult to know. It might be difficult to know what they or you are going to do next, or say, or how they're going to feel. And so that was hard. And Gauguin was not a nice person. He was kind of rude. Vincent was great friends with him, but because he was a rude person, their friendship was very tense. So Gauguin moved to Arles, and he was hoping to have a lot of other artists move with him, including Gauguin. But he painted constantly. Now the thing is, most people didn't like his art. Gauguin, being living the life he lived with depression and all of the difficulties he had, it made him hard to go out, and made it hard for him to go out and sell his work and be where he needed to be. And a lot of people liked him as a person, but they didn't like his art, even though it was incredibly detailed and he was an incredibly talented post-impressionist. But even though people didn't like his art and he was just barely surviving on through anything, he would paint anything and everything that he came across. He painted nature, he painted flowers, he painted people, the people who were important to him. He painted the fields that he lived nearby when he would go outside and see nature. And he would paint himself. There's lots of self-portraits of him. He would paint cafes that he would visit. This here is my favorite of his pieces. I love the vibrant yellow next to the blue sky. He'd paint his life around him, the things he saw, the people he met, the things he did. He would paint night and day and compare how it looked different, how the stars in the sky were different than the electric lights alongside the river that he lived nearby. He painted all he could. He would paint his famous sunflower paintings he made for his friend Gauguin before they got into a fight. And he invited Gauguin to live with him in Arles in the south of France, but remember how I said their friendship was very difficult and how Vincent was a little unstable because of his mental health? Well, you may have heard famously that he sliced his own ear. He didn't cut the entire ear off, just a portion of it, but that's still really bad. And it was bad enough that it was the final straw and made Gauguin move out. So he struggled. He struggled a lot with his life. Not so much with his art. He was very naturally talented, as you can see, but he struggled a lot with his life. There's stories about him even trying to eat yellow paint, not because he was poor, but because he couldn't afford the medicine that he needed. He couldn't afford antidepressant medication, and even if he could have, the type of medication they had in the 1800s isn't nearly as good as what they have now. And so he thought that by eating the yellow paint, he could consume some of the happiness that yellow made him feel. Unfortunately, he was not super successful in his life. Besides being struggling with mental health, he struggled to make money. This painting in front of you, the Red Vineyard, is the one and only painting Van Gogh ever sold in his life. He sold it for 400 francs, which is about $1,000 now. And that's quite a bit. It's not a little amount. I will sell an entire book of illustrations for $1,000. So it was a pretty good amount. However, I sell far more than one book of illustrations a year. Van Gogh only sold this in his life, once in his life. And he sold it to Anna Bock. And Anna was, her brother was really good friends with Van Gogh. So most likely it wasn't even because Anna wanted the painting. It was because she wanted to show her brother that she supported his friend. Now, it was sold for 400 francs back then. I want you to remember that. So Van Gogh struggled with his life. He struggled with his work, and he tried to have happiness. He had good times and bad times. He went to a mental health facility. That's actually where he painted Starry Night, while he was in a mental health facility. And he got a lot better. He got better, but then he would get worse. And it was a roller coaster his whole life. And unfortunately, his depression is eventually what killed him. And it's what a lot of people know him for. Now, we know so much about Van Gogh because of his letters. It's not that he was that much better of an artist than anybody else. It's because after he died, his brother Theo published his letters. He was a brilliant, talented writer. And so people got to know his writing, they got to know his story, and he became more famous. Now remember this painting that he sold for $1,000? Modern curators, which are people who work in art museums, estimate that his painting has gone from being worth $1,000 to $40 million. So let's wonder about how that happened. Van Gogh, when he was painting, since he wasn't selling a lot of things, he made them for his own purposes. This painting here, Van Gogh's chair, he actually meant it to be an object self-portrait. This chair is supposed to represent him. He feels very rustic. He likes wearing straw hats. This is his, I believe it's tobacco in a little wrapped up thing. And he also made another one, a companion, called Gauguin's chair, because remember, he was very good friends with Gauguin. So this chair represents Gauguin. And these pieces were not originally designed for his own house. He knew he wasn't selling artwork, so why not make decorations with them, right? And as I said, this one, Starry Night, was made because this was the view out of his window in the asylum, in the mental health hospital. It was just painting how he felt and how the world made him feel. And now it's worth $1 billion. $1 billion for a painting that at the time he couldn't even sell. Now, the thing about art and value is that we make it up. Art is kind of like stocks or other perceived value in the world. There are paintings that as an artist, you make and you sell, and you can make money because people like it and they respect the amount of work that you put in. And then there are paintings that are sold and make a lot of money because they have an intrinsic value. We're going to look at that now. I have to have a second part of the video. It's going to record too long. So we're going to pick up right here. Please click the link to go on to the next part.